Imagine trying to hold back a river with your bare hands. That's how impossible the Vietnam War became for some of the world's most powerful nations. What began as Vietnam's fight against colonial rule grew into a Cold War showdown where superpowers, ideologies, and millions of lives became entangled in one of history's most controversial conflicts. But before America entered the story, France had already learned a hard truth. Conquering Vietnam was far easier than convincing the Vietnamese people to surrender their dream of independence. Let me explain the whole situation to you in a few minutes. The story begins in 1858 when France began colonizing Vietnam. To the French government, Vietnam was a valuable colony filled with resources and economic opportunities. To many Vietnamese, however, it felt more like having an unwanted guest who had somehow stayed for nearly a century. For decades, France controlled Vietnam as part of French Indochina. Resistance movements appeared regularly, but none would become more important than the movement led by Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a Vietnamese nationalist and communist revolutionary who believed Vietnam should govern itself. Then came World War II. During the war, Japan occupied Vietnam, while France's control weakened dramatically. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Ho Chi Minh saw his chance. On September 2, 1945, he declared Vietnam independent and established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. France responded with what historians often call a very bad decision. Instead of accepting independence, France attempted to re-establish colonial control. The result was the First Indochina War, which lasted from 1946 to 1954. For years, French forces battled the Viet Minh guerrillas led by Ho Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giep. French military planners believed superior weapons would eventually secure victory. The Vietnamese had a different plan. In 1954, the French army established a fortified base at Dien Bien Phu. French commanders believed the position was nearly impossible to defeat. General Giap looked at the fortress and essentially said, "Challenge accepted." His soldiers dragged artillery pieces through mountains, jungles, and terrain many experts considered impossible. The French expected attacks from below. Instead, they found Vietnamese artillery firing down on them from surrounding hills. It was the military equivalent of discovering your opponent had somehow moved the entire battlefield while you weren't looking. After a brutal siege, French forces surrendered on May 7, 1954. The defeat shocked the world. The French Empire was finished. Vietnam's future was about to become far more complicated. Following France's defeat, world leaders met at the Geneva Conference in 1954. The Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam would be controlled by Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam would be led by Ngo Dinh Diem. National elections were supposed to reunify the country in 1956. History, however, had other plans. The elections never happened. Instead, two rival governments developed. North Vietnam became communist and received support from the Soviet Union and China. South Vietnam became anti-communist and received support from the United States to American leaders. This wasn't just about Vietnam, this was the Cold War. President Eisenhower believed in the domino theory. The idea was simple. If one country became communist, neighboring countries might follow. Imagine lining up dominoes on a table. American policymakers worried that if Vietnam fell, the rest of Southeast Asia would topple behind it. Whether the theory was correct remains debated today. What is certain is that it heavily influenced U.S. policy. America began sending money, weapons, and military advisors. When President John F. Kennedy took office, support expanded dramatically by 1963. Approximately 16,000 American advisors were in South Vietnam. Meanwhile, South Vietnam faced serious political problems. President Ngo Dinh Diem became increasingly unpopular. Many South Vietnamese accused his government of corruption and repression. In November 1963, Diem was overthrown and assassinated. Unfortunately for South Vietnam, replacing one unstable government with several unstable governments did not improve stability. Political chaos spread. Then came the incident that changed everything. In August 1964, reports emerged that North Vietnamese patrol boats had attacked American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. The exact details remain controversial. What is not controversial is what happened next. On August 7, 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This gave President Lyndon Johnson authority to dramatically expand military involvement. In March 1965, American combat troops landed at Da Nang. The United States entered the war believing that superior technology, firepower, aircraft, and resources would produce victory. On paper, the advantages were overwhelming. The United States possessed advanced helicopters, fighter jets, bombers, artillery, tanks, and one of the most powerful militaries in human history. The Viet Cong possessed determination, local knowledge, tunnel systems, and a willingness to fight a very different kind of war. One side brought technology, the other brought patience. The result would surprise much of the world. The Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics. They struck unexpectedly and disappeared into jungles and tunnel networks. American soldiers often joked that the enemy seemed to materialize out of thin air and vanish the same way. At times, entire tunnel cities existed beneath American positions. Imagine spending months securing an area only to discover thousands of enemy fighters were practically living underneath it. The United States launched Operation Rolling Thunder in 1965. This massive bombing campaign aimed to pressure North Vietnam into ending support for the insurgency. North Vietnam reviewed the situation and responded with the military equivalent of, "No thank you." The war continued. The Ho Chi Minh Trail became another major challenge. This vast network of supply routes ran through Laos and Cambodia. American bombers struck it repeatedly, yet supplies kept moving. The trail seemed to possess 9 lives. Every time planners believed it was destroyed, it somehow reappeared. Then came one of the most important events of the entire war, the Tet Offensive. On January 30, 1968, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year celebration, known as Tet, Communist forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. More than 80,000 Communist fighters struck cities, towns, military bases, and government centers. Even the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon came under attack. Many Americans watching television could hardly believe what they were seeing. For years they had heard that victory was approaching. Then suddenly fighting seemed to be everywhere. Militarily, North Vietnam suffered enormous losses. Politically, however, the offensive achieved something remarkable. It changed public opinion. Many Americans began asking difficult questions. If victory was near, why did the enemy appear capable of launching attacks on such a massive scale? The credibility gap widened. Television brought war into living rooms every evening. For the first time, many citizens could witness the realities of conflict almost in real time. Public protests increased. College campuses became centers of anti-war activism. The war that had begun thousands of miles away was now dividing American society itself. In 1969, Richard Nixon became president. He inherited a conflict that seemed impossible to win quickly and politically difficult to leave. His solution was Vietnamization. The plan involved gradually transferring combat responsibilities to South Vietnamese forces while reducing American troop levels. In theory, it sounded straightforward. In practice, few things about Vietnam were ever straightforward. Meanwhile, fighting expanded into Cambodia and Laos as efforts continued to disrupt communist supply routes. Protests intensified. One of the most tragic moments occurred on May 4, 1970, when National Guard troops shot and killed 4 students during demonstrations at Kent State University. America was becoming increasingly exhausted by the war. After years of negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973. The agreement called for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of American forces. American combat involvement officially ended. Many hoped peace would follow. Unfortunately, hope and reality do not always travel together. The fighting continued between North and South Vietnam. Without large-scale American military support, South Vietnam found itself in an increasingly difficult position. In early 1975, North Vietnam launched a major offensive. The advance moved with astonishing speed. Cities fell one after another. Military defenses collapsed. The momentum became unstoppable. Then came April 30, 1975. North Vietnamese tanks entered Saigon. As communist forces approached, helicopters evacuated American personnel and Vietnamese civilians in dramatic scenes that would become some of the most iconic images of the 20th century. The war was over. North Vietnam had won. In 1976, Vietnam was officially reunified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The human cost was staggering. More than 3 million Vietnamese died. More than 58,000 American service members lost their lives. Millions more were wounded, displaced, or forever affected by the conflict. The Vietnam War transformed military strategy, journalism, politics, and public trust in government. It taught painful lessons about the limits of military power, the complexity of guerrilla warfare, and the dangers of underestimating a determined opponent. Today, Vietnam and the United States maintain diplomatic relations. Former enemies now cooperate in ways that would have seemed unimaginable during the darkest years of the conflict.